Find out more about the impact a new round of sanctions might have. We turn to John Sitilides. He's a global risk analyst with Triology Advisors, where he focuses on U.S. politics and global policy. For our viewers around the world, this was legislation that looked like a slam dunk yesterday, 419-3 in the House. But that dealt with a number of countries. The Senate's bill, which also passed by a wide margin, just focused on Russia and Iran, and apparently there's this bickering going on Capitol Hill. And of course, the U.S. president doesn't want it. Where do you see this thing going?
Well, this may not sort out for several more weeks, Mike. Maybe we'll see what happens come September. I doubt the Senate will complete its work over the next few days, but it puts us in a very difficult situation vis-a-vis the European Union. Recall that when President Trump, right after he was elected, canceled the transatlantic trade deal that was in the works for several years. So we already have this rift between the United States and Europe over trade issues. Now there are European governments that are concerned their companies will lose out on important energy projects on which they're working with the Russians as a result of these sanctions. It's an unintended consequence, and there's no sure answer that Donald Trump will in fact sign off on this legislation. He may veto it come September.
Yeah, I was going to get to Europe in a minute, but you've already touched on it. European countries have already lost billions in terms of exports with Russia. Of course, energy, they're dependent on it with the earlier sanctions. So they're very annoyed at this. But the other piece of this, of course, Rex Tillerson not happy about it, the White House not happy about it. What about handcuffing the President of the United States and the Secretary of State when it comes to foreign policy, where in the past we just haven't seen that?
Yeah, well, I would say this is not really a Trump issue. Every president wants to maximize constitutional authority. They get their lawyers and say, what's the maximum that I can do in terms of controlling foreign policy? And almost every president has pushed back when they feel that congressional authority overlaps or reaches into presidential authority. So I think President Trump, he will try to push back and make sure that this idea that he'd have to consult the Congress to provide for any sanctions relief is something they're going to try to resist. The problem is, as you correctly mentioned, it's overwhelming majorities, Democratic and Republican. So how does he go against 95% of his own Republicans in the House and the Senate on this bill? So we may have a political showdown between the White House and Congress in a month or so.
And he wants to thaw relations with Russia. We've seen that in the past. This definitely stymies that.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the Russians are foursquare against anything along these lines, and they made very clear in public pronouncements, even though we don't know the final legislation, that if something along these lines passes, it will severely set back Russian-U.S. cooperation in a number of fronts that we may need them on, such as counterterrorism, the fight against Islamic State, and the like, even though we have a number of very important disagreements with the Russians on a whole range of issues.
Action reaction. Obviously, there are countries targeted with this: Russia, Iran, the DPRK. What do we see in terms of reaction?
Well, we're not really very much concerned with what's happening with Iran or North Korea reaction-wise. I mean, those countries we're dealing with in very different ways. But the Russia component with Europe is very important here, Mike. Remember that, as you mentioned very correctly, the Russians control most of the energy pipelines into Europe. So countries such as Germany, 40% of their energy supplies come from Russia. They can't afford to have more salt rubbed into the relationship where they need that energy, but the Russians and the Europeans together seem to be united against this legislation right now.
Let me ask you this, the impact Congress is looking for, and the reason I ask that, one of the members of the French negotiating team in the P5+1 talks with Iran stated bluntly, sanctions do not get sanctioned countries to renounce their strategic objectives. So there are some who feel as though the sanctions can only go so far, can only have so much of an impact. Is this more kind of a show for the domestic audience? I mean, what's the overall point here?
There is sometimes this unfortunate characteristic of lawmakers to do something for the sake of doing something. And they don't really have any clear policy. Look at North Korea. I mean, this is the toughest problem in the world right now. Nobody has a good answer there. Iran, we're completely vexed by what to do with Iran because we have the nuclear agreement that President Trump has twice now said he's certified that they're complying with the agreement, while he's very openly admitted he wants to tear this agreement up. And we don't know to what extent they might be breaking out and cheating on the agreement. So those are very, very vexing problems. But in terms of Europe and Russia, the president's going to be in a real quandary dealing with his desire to open up relations with Russia, not thwart better trade deals and agreements with the Europeans, but not going against 95% of his own fellow Republican caucuses here in the Senate and the House.
It's very interesting to watch here in Washington. John, thanks so much for your observations.
Thanks for having me.